Hi, I'm Pamela Davis with the Reincarnation Chronicle, and we're talking about the roots of reincarnation. This is part 2. And we were talking a moment ago about, in part 1, about the Magi of the Persians and the Chaldeans, the great adepts and masters who were really the architects of that particular belief system in that part of the world, in the Near East. And I'd like to read you something about something that I think you'll recognize right away, one of their core beliefs. The Magi taught that as all living things, nay, all things having existence, organic or inorganic, were but varying manifestations of the one life and being. Therefore, the highest knowledge implied a feeling of conscious brotherhood and relationship toward and with all. So you'll probably recognize part of the Christian teaching in that. And of course, all of these great systems are far more ancient than we've led to believe. All this, as they say, there's nothing new under the sun. So in another part of the world, you have the great teacher Lao Tse. And, you know, in China, there's always this question of, well, did they believe in reincarnation or not? Did they believe in karma or not? There's ambiguity. But the followers of Lao Tse are not really ambiguous about this at all. According to them, Lao Tse did teach the principles of reincarnation and karma to his inner circle of students and believers. And they always talk about the inner circle of the mysteries. They always talk about this kind of knowledge, the really profound knowledge of the mysteries, being restricted to the adepts and to the initiates who had proven themselves at a certain to have mastered a certain level of understanding and ability in order to be worthy of further and deeper information. Because in the olden days, they understood that truly knowledge was power, and particularly this kind of knowledge, which could, in the hands of somebody who had developed a lot of skill, could be used for nefarious goals. And so this is why the knowledge was carefully guarded and very cautiously disseminated. So Lao Tse, who apparently did share this kind of deep knowledge with his initiates, said, "To be ignorant that the true self is immortal is to remain in a grievous state of error and to experience many calamities by reason thereof. Know ye that there is a part of man which is subtle and spiritual, and which is the heaven-bound portion of himself. That which has to do with flesh, bones, and body belongs to the earth, earthly to earth, heavenly to heaven. Such is the law." So this again, you know, this is even part of our burial, our funeral services, right? Earth to earth. And you have, in another part of the world, you have the Druids, who were not only in Great Britain, but also in Gaul, in the northern part of France, which, like for example, Brittany, which was heavily Celtic or Gallic, and in the Roman times, the whole region was called Gallia. And the people, the Gauls who inhabited it, at first were thought by the Romans, because they didn't understand them, to be these wild barbarians. But as it turns out, they had enormous and sophisticated knowledge of so many different things. In fact, Aristotle had first written about the Gauls, you know, and he was the student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates, who was a student of Pythagoras. And so, I don't know, 200-300 BC, Yeah, it would have been around 300 BC that Aristotle was writing about the accomplishments of the Gauls. Aristotle was, of course, the teacher of Alexander the Great. And then after that, a couple of 100 years later, around the first century BC, you have Caesar, who who wrote the Gallic Wars, his most famous piece of writing, and he was extremely impressed with the Gauls and what they knew. And when Caesar and the Romans invaded Britain and subdued the Celts or the Gauls for a certain amount of time, not that long, and they were never really subdued. That was a lot of Roman propaganda. At that time, there were some 60 universities, 60 universities of the Druids throughout the British Isles. And these were full-fledged universities teaching very, very advanced material, so that for a couple of centuries, all of the Roman aristocrats sent their sons and daughters to the Druid universities in Great Britain to be educated, because there was nothing like that in Europe or in Italy. So the Druids were also very much believers in reincarnation, and they taught the immortality of the soul. So let me see what I have here about the Druids. They were so interesting. Now yes, this is the thing that I found so absolutely fascinating, was actually the incestuous interrelationships between the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Druids and all of these people, the Hindus. It says, the philosophy of the Druids bore a remarkable resemblance to the inner doctrine of the Egyptians and their successors, the Grecian mystics. Traces of Hermeticism and Pythagoreanism are clearly discernible, although the connecting link that bound them together has been lost to history, which so often happens. Legends among the Druids connected their order with the ancient Aryan creeds and teachings. Now remember, the Aryans were the ancient peoples of India, the Indian subcontinent. And there seems to have been a very close connection between these priests and those of ancient Greece, for there are tales of offerings being sent to the temples of Greece from the priests of Gaul. Well, that was hundreds of miles too. That was a very great distance, and yet they were sending offerings down there. And it is also related that on the island of Delphos, there was once a Druidic tomb in the shape of a monument believed to have been erected over the remains of Druid priestesses. Druid priestesses on the island of Delphos in Greece, or one of the Greek islands in the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea. Amazing. Herodotus and others speak of a secret alliance between the priests of Greece and those of the Druids. Some of the ancient legends hold that Pythagoras was the instructor of the Druidic priests, and that Pythagoras himself was in close communication with the Brahmins of India and the Hermeticists of Egypt also. Now, they know that Pythagoras spent time in the temple, the sacred, powerful temple of Heliopolis in Egypt. And he also spent time in Greece at the Eleusinian Mysteries. But he's also said to have traveled to India, and he had close connections with the Druids. One of his first teachers was apparently a very powerful Druid master. And then here it says that Pythagoras in turn was a teacher of Druids. So you can see these amazing interrelationships.
What are you reading from?
I am reading from Reincarnation and the Law of Karma, marvelous book by William Walker Atkinson. And if you can find it, it's marvelous. I really suggest that you get that. So other legends have it that the Druids received their first instruction from Zamalias, who had been a slave and a student of Pythagoras. At any rate, the correspondence between the two schools of philosophy is remarkable. And it really is. So you've got these very advanced, Druids, very advanced Greeks, and then who followed the Greeks? Well, the Romans followed the Greeks. But the Romans, and it was probably the reason that they were so skilled at being completely bloodthirsty and crazy dominators, had very primitive esoteric, or not even esoteric beliefs, very primitive religious beliefs, mostly akin to a certain kind of ancestor worship, but nothing. And the common people had very little to believe in at all, which is again certainly probably the reason that Christianity was able to take hold in the Roman Empire as easily and powerfully as it did, because the Romans were kind of adrift in a sea of, no belief. So you've got Romans who borrowed almost everything. They borrowed, especially from the Greeks, everything that was Greek, the Romans took over. Now you've got one of their great philosophers, Cicero, who happened to be one of the ones who believed in reincarnation. And it's interesting that, 1,500 years later or something like that, Cicero was one of the great writers that the Elizabethan dramatists looked to for inspiration. And there is quite an esoteric tradition within the Shakespearean writings, much of it inspired by the writings of Cicero. So let's see. Cicero says, "Know that it is not thou, but thy body alone, which is mortal. The individual in his entirety resides in the soul, and not in the outward form. Learn then that thou art a god, thou the immortal intelligence which gives movements to a perishable body, just as the eternal God animates an incorruptible body." Now, where have we heard this before? Cicero just says, "Thou art a god." Remember in the New Testament when Jesus says to his followers, "Ye are gods. If it were not so, I would have told you." So you see, Jesus too taught his followers that there was an imperishable and immortal part of their souls that was divine, and that would attain salvation through illumination, which again was one of the Christian teachings that kind of got lost along the way, except in, again, the mystery schools, the esoteric teaching centers. So this is part 2 that we're finishing on the roots of reincarnation, and we're going to be looking a little further on and see where else we can find the early traces of reincarnation and that philosophy that spread over the world.